Hey, look what finally happened. Okay, really quickly, I'm not here today to talk about this recent news of Marvel and Sony teaming up on a new Spider-Man. Sorry. I know a lot of people want to see me do a big thing about it, but I honestly don't have a lot to say on the matter, and I wanted to do what I thought would make for a far more interesting video instead. To sum up, I'm still kinda skeptical about it all. Most articles on this seem to be over-exaggerating Marvel's attachment so much that they're also failing to emphasize that Sony is still very much involved in the production. And for that reason, I don't think we should really be praising the Lord for this news, as much as we should hold off on cheering until we've seen the actual movie and it turns out to be good. I mean, can you blame me for being this cautious? But at least they cancelled the Amazing series and Garfield's version of Spider-Man to do it, and it's now heading in a somewhat more hopeful direction. You can check out the Facebook page for my further thoughts. Anyway, now that Spider-Man seems to be back in the mainframe at this moment in time, I've been looking up on the wider reactions around the internet to see what the overall consensus seems to be on all of this. And of course, instead of seeing actual interesting conversations being had, I was disappointed to just see a large portion of fans still whining over Garfield being axed, trying to make this embarrassingly desperate online hashtag trend sound legitimate enough for Sony and Marvel to hire him again, and still going off on one on how seemingly terrible the original Spider-Man was, because apparently in this day and age there's still no way to argue why Garfield works as the character without resorting to just slagging off Tobey Maguire instead. And hey, you know what guys? I'm really sick of it. And now that we've got probably the closest we'll ever get to some kind of untouchable, inarguable evidence that there was clearly something seriously wrong with the Amazing Spider-Man series, why cancel it otherwise? I'd say it's a better time than any to just flat out explain why one series of films and one version of Peter Parker and Spider-Man in particular worked so much better over the other. As much as people don't seem to want to admit it for reasons I can barely fathom, the original Spider-Man trilogy was a film series full of heart, ambition, and innovation, led by good writing and progressive character development, all spearheaded by an extremely talented filmmaker. Spider-Man's 1 and 2 were well-made, smart, layered movies which could stand incredibly strong on their own. Sure, they had awesome action set pieces and nailed the cinematic fluidity one would imagine the character having on screen, but they were good mainly because they were created by honest filmmakers that had a passion for Spider-Man, and they sought to be legitimate, well-made movies before superficially perfect adaptations of the source, which seems to sound like blasphemy to overly spoiled comic book fans today. As Bob Chipman once said, any adaptation of anything has to balance fidelity and affection for the source material with what's creatively right for the adaptation itself. Not only did they nail the character of Peter Parker, we'll get to that in a moment, but they told their own stories and did their own things with the characters that other films might shy away from doing today, and it worked. Even Spider-Man 3, with all of its problems, the morally ambiguous characters, and the incoherent writing, still honestly tried to be about something. It tried to develop the characters, it tried to do new things with the material, it tried to be just as legitimately good as the two that preceded it. There still has yet to be a Doc Ock as engaging as Alfred Molina's, Harry and Norman Osborn had a well-executed, nuanced relationship, Aunt May was spot on, and the origin, the story themes, the characters' ambitions, all were exactly as they should be to rationalize changing what little was changed. They still got Spider-Man. The reason Spider-Man 2 is widely regarded as the best Spider-Man movie is because it's primarily about the characters, not because it happened to contain some of the best superhero action ever, or because the costume looked like it had jumped off the page to the screen, or because it made various homages to Spider-Man No More, but because they sat down, dished out what would be a compelling story for Peter Parker, how that story would relate to the key themes the character was all about, and wrote a screenplay to best tell that story. They were good because they honestly tried. What's interesting about Tobey though is how almost every single dated, boring, superficial complaint people seem to have about him are not problems as much as they are intentional elements incorporated into the character by the actor, the writers, and the director. But I also think this just calls attention to the fact that a lot of supposed Spider-Man fans don't actually understand Spider-Man. Think about the fact that there's a really big reason Peter Parker stands out amongst the crowd of most other superheroes. He's not flawless, he gets pushed around a lot, he struggles to keep everything in his life in check, he gets bullied, he struggles to make ends meet, and he tries not to fuck up his personal relationships. To sum up, he's you and me, and in sharing these common everyday struggles with, well, human beings, no one quite has the same relationship with their readers and viewers as he does. And when he gets bestowed with a power that's far bigger than him, we're connected to the guy enough to invest in the dangers that may befall him as Spider-Man. Way back in the character's beginnings, this was a big deal because it subverted the traditional superhero caricature, and funnily enough, with two of the biggest superheroes on screen right now being Batman and Iron Man, both characters with immense power even outside of their superhero personas, this still very much remains relevant today. Now consider the task of bringing that protagonist to the big screen, one that the audience relates to in a big way, but also wants to literally be when it comes to his superheroics. This is not only completely achievable, but was already perfectly done all the way back in 1962. The rule essentially goes that the character can still have elements and qualities that you would like to have yourself, a la superpowers, but those qualities should not contradict the characteristics that sparked the audience's relation to him in the first place. Sure, I'd love to have looked as pretty as Andrew Garfield and been unbelievably smart and get to f*** Emma Stone in high school whilst being bullied, but the problem is, I didn't. I was shy and I was insecure because I was being bullied. Sound familiar? And maintaining those elements which dictated the kind of shy, intimidated character I was back then would not result in me also being an edgy rule breaker, or skateboarding down the corridors, or standing up to bullies, or getting to f*** Emma Stone at the same time. It's sad, but it's true. And not only is this the key difference that separates these two versions, and the very thing that defines the original trilogy's take on the character, but is also the very thing that a lot of Spider-Man fans don't seem to understand. You shouldn't want to be Peter Parker, you should want Peter Parker to be you. And Tobey, Raimi, the writers, they 100% got that. And to achieve this on screen, a conscious choice was made to make Maguire's version a far more grounded one than anyone had really done before. That's why he was a little shy, that's why he was insecure, that's why he was awkward, that's why he was a bit of a loser, that's why he was even kinda dweeby every now and then. While some see it as outdated or an unfaithful performance of the character, it actually made him a pretty darn accurate representation of what a real life Peter Parker would be like. And because with that comes a harsh truth for Spider-Man fans that the guy they root for is not the coolest hipster jock around, they see Maguire's version as some kind of insult to their very beings as Spider-Man fans, when to the contrary, all that does is show that they don't properly understand the character they claim to be a fan of. Him having a kind of raspy voice one would only imagine a really shy guy having, yeah, as it turns out, that fits perfectly. You feeling awkward watching him try to win MJ over with poetry in the second movie, yeah, that fits perfectly. You feeling awkward watching him try to be confident without his powers, yeah, that fits perfectly. That's why instead of creating super complex machinery to visually prove his smarts, we learnt about his intelligence through subtleties in the dialogue and character interactions. That's why he slowly gains more charisma and we learn more about him as the narrative progresses in Spider-Man 1. Not because he's bland or dull, but because when you take a socially awkward teenager and graduate him from high school, he naturally takes a while to come out of his shell. Yeah, as it turns out, most average teenage boys don't look like male models when they cry. They scrunch their faces up and look like total messes. And with the exception of Spider-Man 3, him doing it more than once was a good thing. Nothing should stick with the viewer more than the idea that Peter Parker failed to stop the thief, failed to do the right thing, failed Uncle Ben, which is one of the key backbones behind the character's motivation, and the movie's tendencies to dwell on that is them demanding that you get that this is why Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Guilt. Him looking like he's in the process of shitting his pants whilst trying to stop the train, yeah, I'd probably look like that too if I were doing the same. My point is, most of what Tobey did, what he said, and how he acted was intentionally unflattering. Peter Parker is not meant to be a power fantasy. Spider-Man is. Again, Tobey, Raimi, the writers, they understood that and changed various elements and aspects accordingly. Sure, it's great to see him transform into the fun web-slinger, but Spider-Man joking around as often as he did in the comics can only ever be taken so far if we're meant to believe that he's a real dude. That's why the one-liners were never taken to a point of excess where they became so tedious it robbed the scenes of any potential investment. But that also doesn't mean that he's not still fun to watch in those scenes or that they don't still make me wish I was Spider-Man. He clearly shouts to the world how much he loves web-slinging and has an upbeat attitude every time he talks. And he's still busted out the one-liners. He just only ever did it when the circumstances were light-hearted enough to warrant it. More importantly, he also knew to shut up when the situation was so dangerous that it demanded a serious Spider-Man. He does his gags a couple of times during the bank heist, the wrestling match, and his very first encounter with Sandman, but when people like Aunt May, Mary Jane, or innocent civilians are directly put in harm's way, that's when it all stops being funny and it's time to get down to business. That is Spider-Man. The Amazing Spider-Man movies, on the other hand, were cursed by an overabundance of studio interference and business-oriented filmmaking, when it wasn't deviating all the important stuff that creates the heart and soul of a movie, i.e. interesting stories and well-developed characters, to instead meticulously calculate its several unrelated plot points to set up 5 different sequels and spin-offs. The primary focus was in constantly trying to pander to as many different audience members as it possibly could, even if those individual target viewers were so different from one another that it meant drastically altering characters, tone, story and consistency from scene to compensate for all that. You really think the reason the series so jarringly went from a Batman Begins tone to an Avengers tone was some weird attempt at keeping true to the source, and not only done because people were really into it at the time? Garfield's Peter Parker didn't work on the other hand because the overall mentality when writing him was exactly the same, constantly trying to pander to everyone at every chance they could get, and in doing so completely squandering any and all potential of creating a consistent protagonist worth investing in. Not to mention the fact that having him be indirectly responsible for both Uncle Ben and Gwen's death shows a blatant misunderstanding of the material. Yet because the 100 different traits they crammed into him appeased so many viewers' egos, i.e. cool hip teenagers, but also socially awkward bully victims, but also the emotionally sensitive crowd, but also confident jocks, but also teenage romance fangirls, but also comic book fans, but also kids, etc, 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 I honestly can't tell if a lot of them seemed to think they were getting a faithful version of the character, or they just straight up ignored those flaws because, hey, at least he's still cracking a lot of jokes in the costume. Or maybe that's when they decided to start pulling the "it's based on Ultimate Spider-Man" excuses out of their asses. The only reason they had him joke was to appease comic book fans, which would be why the overall scenes of him joking go on, and he blatantly makes the situation worse, and he's also kind of insufferable whilst doing it. Making it work well in the movie is an afterthought. The primary focus was on doing it at all. That's not enough. Look, forgetting about the fact that they just made this version of the character one really easy to hate kind of guy, when you try to force so many contradictory attributes into a protagonist that can only have so many before he stops to seem like a real person, he becomes a cartoon character, constantly being swayed by the writers to pander to the needs of an audience that doesn't properly understand him. Which is exactly what Raimi and Maguire proved wasn't necessary over 10 years earlier back in 2002. Once Peter Parker and Spider-Man become interchangeable, it goes against the very things that originally made the character work so well with his audience. Overall, it just tried too hard to make him cool, and to make the viewer want to be Peter Parker, and that's just not the way it's meant to work. Spider-Man is cool, but Peter Parker is not. And if he is, well, this isn't what he looks like, this is. That's why Tobey Maguire was perfect and why Andrew Garfield was not. So, Marvel and Sony, especially Sony in fact, my one and only message to you is try. Try to tell new stories, try to do unique things with the characters and the material. Keeping true to the integrity of whatever it is you're adapting is key as well, of course it is, that goes without saying, but the more important thing is that you find brave and bold new ways of doing it, even if that means doing things that might piss people off. Some may disagree, but look at the facts here. One series got to 3, and one series didn't. Believe it or not, that speaks wonders. Cheers for watching guys, and as always if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel.